Morning, everyone. Thank you for the elaborate introduction, Janagi. Without much further ado, I would like to jump on to my presentation. As we have little time, I have a lot to cover to introduce you all to the developing genre, climate change fiction, popularly known as cli-fi. Once again, I need a clarification regarding my video and audio. Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, from the title slide itself, it's an image that I created with the help of OpenAI. In the visual, there is a central human figure surrounded by books and various climate change events. The book in the visual represent the role of writing, creativity, and critical thought in addressing today's global crisis. As I earlier said, this session is an introduction to climate fiction, a genre that is burgeoningly developing. Given our time constraint, I won't cover everything in detail, but I hope to provide a solid foundation for further exploration. So we'll move through 6 key areas as shown in this slide. Let's begin with the first one, understanding climate and climate change. Next slide, please. Next. As all of you may be knowing, climate is the long-term average of weather patterns, typically over 30 years. It includes temperature, rainfall, and wind. This is the definition given by World Meteorological Organization and also the IPCC glossary. It is derived from the Greek klinon, which originally means the Earth's latitudinal zones. Next slide, please. Climate change, on the other hand, refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. These changes can occur due to natural causes, but since the Industrial Revolution, human-driven emissions have significantly altered these shifts. So we'll be exploring the realm of fiction and climate change today. First of all, we have to understand what is climate and climate change to understand this developing genre. As all of you know, climate is the long-term average of weather patterns, typically over 30 years, and climate change, on the other hand, refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. A key distinction to make here is between weather and climate and between global warming and climate change. Can you please move the slides? Next one. Next one. Yes. So the key distinction to make here is between weather and climate and between global warming and climate change. Weather represents short-term conditions like rain or storms, while climate is the long-term trend observed over decades. Similarly, global warming refers to specifically the rise in Earth's temperature due to greenhouse gas emissions, whereas climate change encompasses not just warming, but also rising sea levels, glacier melt, extreme weather, and shifts in ecosystems. Next slide. As all of you may be knowing, climate action is one of the Sustainable Development Goals of UN, and addressing climate change requires action at all levels, which is why it has been recognized as the 13th Sustainable Development Goal by the UN, and climate action focuses on mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience. Efforts in this directions comes from various organizations such as World Meteorological Organization, IPCC, UNFCCs, and other bodies. They all play a key role in research, policy making, and climate response. While we won't be exploring their functions detailedly, their contributions form the backbone of global climate action. Beyond science and policy, creative writing itself is a form of climate action. It helps raise awareness, shape public perception, and inspire change. Since climate change has multiple causes and effects, its impacts are equally diverse, influencing nature, human, non human, and government policies. Next slide, please. These are some of the causes and effects, and it's visible that the causes and effects of climate change are multifold. Next slide. These are the potential climate change impacts given by Environmental Protection Agency. See, there are various impacts of climate change. Its impact can be visible across the life stages of a human. The impact is visible on nature, environment, human, non-human, all flora and fauna, and even the government and its policies. Next slide. These are some vector illustrations to represent the manifold impacts of climate change. Next slide. See the interactions between climate change, people, and nature. There is an interdependency between climate, people, and nature. So a change in climate may disrupt all the balance. Next slide. I have provided the source of every image that I have taken as a link and also as a text. Climate change is a hyperobject. Hyperobject is a concept given by the philosopher Timothy Morton. It has the following 5 characteristics. Why climate change is a hyperobject? It is very difficult to grasp the full scale of climate change. It qualifies as a hyperobject because it is so vast in time, space, and impact that it becomes difficult to fully comprehend. As climate change is both vast and deeply intertwined with human existence, it has become a hot topic in creative writing and a challenging theme to explore in fiction. Next slide. Now, we will be moving on to the core area of today's discussion, which is the exploration of climate fiction as a developing genre. Next slide. This is the few milestones of cli-fi's evolution. Literally speaking, the literary discourses on climate change were there from the ancient literature, from the oral literature itself. In every literature, the presence of climate and the changes to climate is visible from the oral traditions. But cli-fi as a genre, its evolution began with a 2005 burning question by the writer Robert Macfarlane. And it appeared in a newspaper article. He asked, where are the novels, the plays, the poems, the songs of the massive contemporary anxiety on climate change? The question emphasized the lack of climate narratives in literature and called for creative writers to engage with the unfolding climate crisis. This question was posed in 2005, and later it was in 2011 the popular coinage of cli-fi by Dan Bloom happened. Cli from climate, fi from fiction. Climate change fiction or climate fiction, popularly known as cli-fi. In 2011, 2 key developments defined cli-fi. First, Dan Bloom coined the term as a wake-up call to emphasize the importance of climate storytelling. He also launched the cli-fi report as a research tool for academics and media professionals to know more about climate change fiction. Around the same time, in 2011, Adam Trexler and Adeline Jones-Putra published the first major academic study on climate fiction, linking it to eco-criticism and eco-historicism. These two milestones firmly established cli-fi as both a literary and scholarly movement. Following this, cli-fi gained mainstream attention in 2012 through Margaret Atwood's tweet on cli-fi. Actually, Dan Bloom used or coined the portmanteau cli-fi to indicate the work Polar City Red. And Margaret Atwood retweeted Dan Bloom's coinage of cli-fi in 2012, and this tweet revolutionized and popularized cli-fi. Later, in 2015, Atwood's article, It's Not Climate Change, It's Everything Change, helped distinguish cli-fi from sci-fi, positioning it as a realist genre grounded in climate realities. In the same year, Trexler's book on cli-fi, the first book-length study on climate change fiction, appeared. And following in 2016, Adeline Jones Putra updated the 2011 research article with more works. And in the same year, the revolutionary publication of Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, Climate Change and Unthinkable also occurred, which revolutionized the whole history and evolution of this genre. And actually, nowadays, it is considered cli-fi as pre-Great Derangement cli-fi and post-Great Derangement cli-fi. Amitav Ghosh's influence was such that it actually divided this genre as pre and post derangement. To be more elaborate on the evolution of cli-fi, when Adam Trexler first began to study the evolution of cli-fi, there were some science fiction dominated works, and she also noted lack of serious engagement. He could only see some literary and middlebrow fiction of like P.C. Boyle's A Friend of Earth, Doris Lessing's Mara and Dan, Ian McEwan's Solar, and Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. And there was an over representation of science fiction and speculative fiction, like the works of King Stanley Robinson, Octavia Butler, and a few others. Later, Axel Goodbody and Adeline Jones-Putra traced the origins of climate fiction further back, identifying works that engaged with climate change before the coinage of cli-fi. And they recognized Ursula K. Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven, which was published in 1971, as the pioneering work. They also noted Arthur Herzog's Heat, George Turner's The Sea and Summer, and they attributed that the first major wave of cli-fi happened after 1990s. Next slide, please. These are some of the influences on this genre. The scientific data from various organizations like IPCC, UNFCCC, WMO, and the influence of various non-fictional works, journal articles, web pages, podcasts, book reviews, newspaper articles, all on climate change fiction helps in the development of this genre. The articles from Guardian, the New York Times, the Hindu, the New Yorker frequently feature reviews and discussions on climate fiction, and platforms like Chicago Review of Books and podcasts such as The Burning Column by Amy Brady further engages audiences in the intersection of literature and climate awareness. Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, Climate Change and Unthinkable revolutionized the whole scenario by critiquing the mainstream fiction's failure to address climate crisis, calling it as a crisis of culture and that of imagination. He examines the historical, political, and cultural factors that have sidelined climate narratives and urges writers to adopt a new literary style that fully engage with climate realities. This publication transformed the discourse on climate fiction, influencing both writers and scholars to rethink how literature can address environmental crisis. Moving on, next slide, please. Influential scholars and writers. Next. These are some of the influential figures and key scholars that I have just said. There are more. I have listed some here. Next slide, please. The key non-fictional works and writers who are of great influence in this field. Next slide. I have listed some of the key fictional works that can be termed as climate change fiction here, along with some images. I have incorporated 2 slides on the same. So, climate fiction is not a one-size-fits-all genre. The complexities of climate change require multiple narrative approaches to explore its scientific, social, emotional, political, and economic dimensions. Different types of cli-fi is a result of this manifold challenge. A multiple type approach ensures that cli-fi remains dynamic, inclusive, and relevant. And it is the reader who should decide what is the genre or subgenre of this work of fiction that deals with climate change. It's up to the reader because there may be explicit or implicit representation of climate change. And it may be fall into various subgenres also. Moving on, next slide. Next slide. Yes, subgenres and narrative techniques in cli-fi. Next slide. These are various subgenres of cli-fi. As you will be familiar with dystopian, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, speculative, realist, hybrid versions of cli-fi. There is also a version which can be categorized as solution-based cli-fi, which is also which can also come under a sub-branch of science fiction, like King Stanley Robinson's work, where a ministry is set up for to mitigate climate change. And there are works from indigenous writers who is speaking from the indigenous perspective, to go back to the roots, to go back to the primitive living, to live with the environment. Such perspective is given from indigenous writers. Then we can also classify it as proto-cli-fi or pre-cli-fi and cli-fi. The text which come before the coinage of the term cli-fi, and the text that came later after the coinage of cli-fi. And I have given some examples like Ursula Gaines' work and The Heat and Summer, all the works that Adam Trexler and Axel Goodbody and Adeline Jones-Putra identified when they initiated the 2011 article and the first book-length study on climate change fiction. And it is no wonder that there's a subgenre called children's cli-fi in this developing area. These books are actually a call for children for a climate activism, to instill a climate activism in them. And there's an Indian author called Bijal Vajrajani, whose book, I forgot the title, yes, A Climate Called Burra. It's one of the examples. There are so many other books there are graphic novels also. graphic cli-fi is also there, and there are some young adult cli-fi. In children's cli-fi, the activism, the installation of an activism is for children. The aimed audience are children, and in young adult cli-fi, the targeted audience are the young ones. This maybe the adolescent people. Then cli-fi can also be divided or categorized as cli-fi written in English and cli-fi written in English translation. There are so many popular works which are not actually written in English but are translated into English. And based upon the thematic concern, we can also categorize cli-fi as what is fiction and what might be fiction. What is will be dealing with the reality, and what might be will be speculating on what will happen in the future. Although it is not so futuristic, the changes and the impacts of climate change is happening right now. Moving on, the various narrative techniques used by the fiction writers. There are non-linear narratives, near future speculation, dystopian and post-apocalyptic settings. Hyper realism is always is engaged. Then multiple perspectives is also employed. Some works like which comes under the science fiction category more uses scientific and policy discourses. There will be always tension and conflict in the narrative. Then personal and global experiences and narratives were mixed. Then slow violence representation is there. Mythological and allegorical elements will be there, especially from the works which are from indigenous perspective. Hybrid forms are employed. Hope, punk, and utopian imaging. There will be always a hope to reverse the situation, or at least to survive the situation. Resilience is the major theme or a factor that is seen in such novels. And most of the time, the novels are fragmented, which really equals with the objectivity of climate change. Then integration of various narrative voices. There are works which includes the human narrator will be there, and also a non-human narrative will be there. To say one example, Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newburyport. This is a book that is recommended for the Booker Prize, although it didn't win. In that novel itself, there's a human narrator and an animal narrator. So the effects of climate change on human and non-human is described parallelly. And government, corporate, and policy-centric narratives is also there. And Kim Stanley Robinson's works mainly portrays such elements. Like there will be some policymakers or scientists as characters, and they will be going after a solution to change the situation. So these are some of the various narrative techniques that are employed in climate change fiction. And to give an explanation or to give an example to the hybrid form, I would really suggest you to read Jenny Orville's novel Weather, again, which is nominated for Booker Prize. The novel is very concise, but there are multiple elements. Diary element is there. Some elements are given in boxes. And even in Ducks Newburyport, you will be having some emojis. The emoji of music is there, and long interlogues, long monologues. So many things are combined into one. To see climate change as a reality that is happening, that is there in our daily life. So such narrative techniques are employed by these writers. Moving on. Next slide, please. Yes, intersections. Can we consider, next slide, can we consider climate change as a single genre or a genre or which has influence from other scholarships? Like, or is it a extension of eco-criticism or environmental fiction? This is a major debate. There are people or scholars who consider cli-fi as a distinct genre. Scholars like Trexler, Axel Goodbody, Adeline Jones-Putra, they consider this as a separate genre. In my research, I am also considering this as a separate genre, but it has influence from science fiction, from environmental fiction, from eco-criticism, and vulnerability studies, and then environmental humanities also. And the overlapping themes are Anthropocene, sustainability, human nature relationships, survival, resilience. All these are covered in most of these works. So it is up to the reader or the researcher to see it as a separate genre or a sub-genre or an extension of environmental fiction. As environment and climate are inseparable to a certain limit, this goes along with climate change fiction and environmental fiction. Moving on. Next slide. Challenges and future of climate fiction. What are the challenges that this fiction, this type of fiction faces? I have listed some. Too much scientific detail can overwhelm readers. So while oversimplification also risks the inaccuracy. So balancing science and storytelling is one of the major challenge of this type of fiction. Avoiding climate fatalism and despair, reaching out for a broader audience, representation and diversity, commercial viability and market trends, keeping pace with the rapid climate developments and the developing scientific data, overcoming political polarization and climate denialism, avoiding repetitive apocalyptic themes, bridging the gap between fiction and science, or between the scientific data and the real life situation. Then the psychological impact, addressing the psychological, emotional impact of climate change, are one of the are some of the major challenges that the writers of cli-fi face. You will be knowing certain terms relating to climate change. There is a separate branch called climate psychology, which actually deals with the psychological realism of climate change. It talks about certain terms like climate emotions, climate anxiety, all the psychological impacts of climate change. And there is also climate politics, the politics of climate change. Every government, every nation has its own climate politics. So addressing the political sensitivities become a challenge also. Moving on, the future of this genre. These are some of the possible futuristic expansion that may happen. Rise of hope, more works of hope punk and solution-based narratives should be there. Then actually this genre is considered as a Western one. But in Indian fiction itself, we have considerable number of works which actually can be classified as cli-fi. Although these are not explicit as the Western counterparts, they are more into the they can be more considered as an extension of eco-critical fiction or environmental fiction that turns that moves from the consideration of flora and fauna to the impact of climate change on humans, but more like more giving specificities and influence to the environment itself. In Indian English fiction, the works that actually deals with the psychological realism of climate change is still a few, but there are works which can be considered as cli-fi in Indian English fiction also. Everything the Light Touches by Janice Parriott is one, and there's a Netflix series based on Prayag Akbar's Laila, which is also an apocalyptic Indian cli-fi. And Bijal Vajrajani, she is writing some children's cli-fi on climate change. And there are some contemporary Indian fiction which actually talks about some of the climate change events that are happening in Delhi. Amitabh Ghosh is a certain example, but although he's not directly talking about the psychological realism of climate change on humans, he's also talking about Sundarbans and the effect of climate change on Sundarbans. So collaboration with scientists, policymakers, more works on the realist type of climate change, then growth of serialized and short form or short cli-fi fiction text, and integration of these texts in the curriculum, more emphasis on climate justice and social inequality, and a shift from future speculation to present realities, and the blending of genres and expansion of Western and indigenous perspective all can further enrich this type of fiction, which is a major necessity now. Moving on. This is the concluding slide that I prepared with the help of OpenAI. You can see a book, a hand holding the book. On the one side, you can see the greenery, and the other side, you can see so many climate change events. So actually, fiction has the power to persuade people. I need the last slide here. To persuade people, because a little change will go a long way. So I would like to conclude the session by quoting from Lisa Sunshine's Theory of Mind. I began the quote by imagining the hidden mental states of fictional characters by following the readily available representations of such states throughout the narrative, and by comparing our interpretation of what the given character must be feeling at a given moment with what we assume could be the author's own interpretation. We deliver a rich simulation to the cognitive adaptations constituting our theory of mind. This is exactly what climate fiction does. It allows us to step into the experience of others, transforming climate change from an abstract issue into something personal, emotional, deeply human, and thus global. So thank you all for your time, engagement. Now, I would like to hear from you. This is my first time as a speaker here. I was a beneficiary to a Nucleus team a few times. I attended their webinars, and I immensely got information from them. So when I got such an opportunity to be a presenter, that's too for the first time on Women's Day itself, it was actually a cherry on cake. So I would like to hear from you about the session. I must admit that I couldn't go into great detail because of the time constraint. So now the floor is open for discussion. Thank you.